Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Little Miss Sunshine, starring Greg Kinnear, Steve Carell, Toni Collette, Paul Dano, Abigail Breslin, and Alan Arkin, directed by Jonathan Dayton and Valerie Faris. Now, I do remember going to theaters for this and having a decent time with this, as I don't remember how I liked it back then, but let's see if it holds up. Let's get into the movie. A family with issues get their youngest daughter at the age of 7 years old, named Olive, played by in the best performance by Abigail Breslin, to a contest where it's ran by a sister of Cheryl, played by Toni Collette, while her husband Richard, played by Greg Kinnear, makes an announcement about winners and losers. And that's the Greg Kinnear I'm not the biggest fan of, as I know him as an actor. As meanwhile, Dwayne, played by Paul Dano, is silent for most of the movie. Richard's father, Edwin, played by Alan Arkin, does cocaine, and Cheryl's brother, Frank, played by Steve Carell, tried to commit suicide as he has to stay away from sharp objects and believes he has no reason to be alive at all. And I like the characters as they're relatable in their own ways, while Richard not so much. Frank comes to his house of his sister's family, and they get set up for dinner while Richard calls Stan Grossman, played later on by Bryan Cranston, 2 times in a row after this and The Lincoln Lawyer, to tell you the truth, to see if he has a deal about a book he wrote, while Dwayne is silent because he hates everyone as he communicates by pen and paper. And I really like the setup for these characters before we get to the plot of the movie. Frank learns Dwayne is taking the vow of silence for 9 months as Olive asks Frank about what happened to him, while Richard comes off like an asshole to his family about what his dream is for Dwayne, as he comes off obnoxious as Olive, and as she asks Frank why did he want to kill himself, and he brings up how another dude man he crushed on was in love with the other dude man, as he didn't love him back. And these characters are relatable. While Frank asks Dwayne, he has always been an asshole, and how can he stand it, as Richard brings up a message from Cheryl's sister, Cindy, about Olive having a place in the Little Miss Sunshine contest in California, as she has a place in the contest and screams off the top of her lungs, while Richard and Cheryl argue with one another about going to California, and they decide to go to California together as a family, and Frank agrees and Dwayne reluctantly agrees to come to the plot to come to California, and the plot of going to California as a family to get a little girl in a pageant there is, I can relate with a family that goes on a road trip for California for that purposes. I have to confess though, I never liked road trips because sitting on my ass for say 10 hours, for example, I can't do that shit in general, as I can get numb so freaking easily. But let's move on. They go on the road to California while Edwin gives advice to Dwayne to fuck a lot of women and don't live like him, as he smoked a lot of heroin, as Edwin tells Frank about paradise. And at the end of the scene, Olive turns around and asks what are they talking about, and Edwin says politics, which made me laugh as they go to a diner for breakfast. And I'm not going to talk about my politics, but that's kind of a funny thing to bring up, as they go to the diner for breakfast and they order their food, as Olive orders ice cream with waffles, and Richard brings up how ice cream has fat in it and talks about being skinny versus fat, and gives her the wrong idea and shares the ice cream with her family, and eventually has some of her own. And Richard comes off like a fucking douchebag, and the cinematography is great throughout, but Jesus, Richard is the biggest motherfucking douchebag throughout this entire goddamn movie. Their vehicle, called the bus they drive, is breaking apart, like the clutch, for example, as they take it to an auto shop and asks for the part, as they have to order it and wait till the weekend, or else they could push the car together to switch gears, which is the iconic shots on the poster and in this movie. While Richard talks about the book deal with Stan and catches Frank's sarcasm as he calls Frank a loser. And that was a douchey thing to say in general, as Richard gets on the phone with Stan about the book deal, and he goes to a payphone to talk with Stan, while Frank gets some and receives bad news, while Frank gets some porno magazines for Edwin, excuse me, and a gay magazine for him, and bumps into his man crush in the convenience store, making this scene fucking awkward, as it was well acted by Steve Carell. I'll give him that. And after getting off the phone with Stan, Richard is very upset and takes it out on Cheryl and accidentally leaves Olive behind. And Dwayne notices and writes it to show Frank's so he could say it, which is iconic. But how fucked up was it to leave a 7-year-old girl all by herself while going to California without her? As the world is a scary fucking place, but eventually they pick her up. And I like the way Steve Carell says the line, "Where's Olive?" As that stuck with me, as was most of the dialogue. They get to a motel as Olive stays with Edwin, Frank stays with Dwayne, and Richard stays with Cheryl as they have a talk about an argument they had at the beginning of the movie, while while at the same time maybe talking about a divorce. It's never said. And while talking about Stan, as Dwayne hears them next door yelling at one another and smiles about it, which is creepy anyways, as Paul Dano pulls off creepy very well, but he's not supposed to be in this movie as far as the creepiness goes. While Olive is scared about being a loser, as he explains how she's trying so hard to not be one. And that was an effective dialogue while Richard goes to Scottsdale to talk with Stan in person and tries to use the bus, but it doesn't work, and borrows a kid's motorbike to get there and back, which is kind of a bad idea. And he arrives at the hotel in Scottsdale and talks with Stan, and that's when we see Bryan Cranston, as he tells him the world doesn't know who Richard is, as nobody cares. And I like the scene, as it was well acted and well shot, and this movie is well made. Edwin dies the next morning, as Olive tells them he won't wake up, and they go to the hospital while Cheryl talks with Olive about the death and cries. And Dwayne writes and shows Olive to go hug Mom, as the doctor comes in and says he passed away, and to ask someone by the name of Linda, who's a receptionist, to talk with him about the remainings of as Richard tries to talk with her about leaving the body in the hospital anyways, and decides to take his body out of the hospital behind their backs, the hospital, I mean, and take off with it on their bus. And this was really funny to me, and both haha while strange, as this fits as the dark comedy at best, and it works as that, in my opinion. They continue forward to California, and Olive asks Frank about if he believes in heaven, and next thing you know, some asshole cuts them off, and the horn makes so much noise as a cop pulls them over and asks Richard to step out of the vehicle and acts strangely in front of the cop, and he checks the trunk and sees some pornography as he lets them off the hook, which is hilarious, as this isn't a Wes Anderson kind of dark comedy, but I enjoy on its own merits. And they continue while the horn is acting funny, while Dwayne is colorblind and has a meltdown, asks the family to pull over and starts to talk and screams "fuck" in the middle of the hill, and continues his meltdown and says he hates these people and to leave him alone, as he was explicit about it in the beginning of the movie, until Olive comes up to him and calms him down. And the scene is heartbreaking at first, but at the end of it, it became heartwarming, as Dwayne apologizes for his meltdown, and I really like that scene. They get to the hotel where Little Miss Sunshine is taking place at the corner of time of arrival, which is around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and arrive 5 minutes later while the owner is being rude about it, as they beg her to help them out. And someone named Kirby helps them out by putting them into the system, as it's only 5 minutes, and he's not working for them next year, is what he said in the dialogue at one point. And they visit Miss California and gets her autograph, and she asks if she eats ice cream and says she loves it, as her favorite flavor is chocolate cherry Garcia, as that's a gelato, and that was beautiful, as this is a beautiful movie about family and getting little girls into pageants. The show begins while Olive seems a little nervous while on stage as the singer of America the Beautiful, sounding horrible. Like his version of that song is so bad. As we get to the beach scene with Frank and Dwayne, as Dwayne says fuck the Air Force Academy, as well as he can fall asleep until he was 18 years old. While staring at the ocean, and the girls get to the talent show from the girls and eventually get to Olive and performs as Richard and Dwayne don't want Olive to go out there, as she gets called on and she dances to the song Super Freak and acts erotic, which sounds inappropriate for a 7-year-old, but the scene was fucking hysterical, as I was laughing my ass off. And the owner of the Little Miss Sunshine hates it, as it was applauded by Kirby and another guy Richard talks to earlier in the scene. And the owner of the show calls the cops and tells them to get these people on no more pageant ever again, as they get banned from entering the state of California, and they take off and goes back home. And the climax was hysterical. But how hysterical? Let's find out in a rating. I'll give this movie a 8.2 out of 10. I like the setup for the characters, as they're relatable and very likable, except for Richard, as he comes off like a fucking douchebag. And the performances are great throughout, while the cinematography is great to watch throughout. And there were times the movie was funny in a ha-ha way. And despite this isn't R-rated, this isn't any R-rated raunchy humor kind of bullshit I've been watching that I don't wish to watch for the last 15 years. The dialogue is effective, as it's well written, and this is well acted, well shot, and well made. And this movie was funny in a ha-ha/strange way, as this movie fits as dark comedy at best. And it works as that, in my opinion. And this isn't a Wes Anderson dark comedy, but I still enjoy this as a dark comedy. This is a beautiful movie about family and getting little girls into beauty pageants, as it's cute, sweet, and funny. And this is a solid recommendation for this movie. And the climax made this movie hysterical, as I was busting my ass off during that performance by Olive, as Abigail Breslin was the best thing about the movie, in my opinion, as she was great in it. And I'm sorry she had to go through all the horrible sex trafficking, whatever was going on with her. I'm sorry she went through all that. I'm just going to say that right now, because that's completely inappropriate. So I would like to thank you guys for joining me for this review. And until then, Little Miss Sunshine.